Aloha. Welcome to our special conversation with the CEO for the Hawaii ʻUlu Co-op. This conversation is presented by Huakai ʻIke Aina and the University of Hawaiʻi, West Oahu. Dana, it's great to have you in the studio today.
Great to be here, Kyle.
We're going to be talking all about cooperatives today, and of course we're going to be talking about Hawaii, but also we're going to be talking about the Pacific and even globally. And maybe we can start off by telling us how you got into cooperatives, because it wasn't just landing a job for the Hawaii ʻUlu Co-op, but you're kind of a cooperative person through and through.
This is true. Well, I was born on a kibbutz, which is a cooperative agricultural community in northern Israel. And my parents left when I was a kid. They moved to the US. But I think I always felt nostalgic for the co-op, not so much because I was old enough to miss it, but because I heard my family talking about it so much. I'm the youngest of four, and there's a big span of ages. So my oldest brother actually stayed in Israel. My sister went back because she didn't like the US. And there was just always reminiscing in the house I grew up in about, I don't know, more idealistic days, you know, the benefits and the funny stories and the people. And I just grew up being nostalgic for it. And, you know, we'd go back to visit, but it wasn't the same thing as living there. So when I graduated from college, I ended up getting a Fulbright to go back to Israel and study Israel's cooperatives, or at least their kibbutzim, which is their cooperative communities. And my master's thesis, I ended up staying for grad school, and my master's research looked at how cooperatives with different like degrees of cooperativeness along a spectrum, how well the businesses that belong to those communities adapted to outside economic stressors. So pretty specific, but essentially looking at the adaptive capacity of cooperatives that were more or less collective. And what we found was that there are some real advantages, economic advantages, to collective structures. Things like the ability of the community to prioritize long-term collective benefits over short-term individual profit. Things like that actually allowed them to reinvest profits one year in longer-term strategies that would end up benefiting everybody much more, but it was going to take 10 years. Things like that. And there were other really interesting insights regarding the formalization of collective structures. So if you can really institutionalize a good way of doing things that's collective, that could lead to much more inclusive decision-making around entrepreneurship, which ultimately also had economic benefits on the community, because you were taking serious consideration of business ideas or new entrepreneurial ideas from people who may not be in the inner circle of decision makers, but you had a process for inviting ideas, vetting them, even funding them with seed investment. So that was my co-op experience prior to moving to Hawaii in 2010. And after I got here, my first job was working for a honey farm on the Big Island. And one of the projects I was tasked with was helping the owner come up with a succession plan because he was looking to retire. And one of the succession plan ideas on the table was transitioning the business to a worker-owned cooperative. And so I led a whole assessment of the viability, and the employees at the time were actually pretty interested, but what ended up making it a no-go was the varroa mite and the small hive beetle invasive species pressures on the honey industry at that time. And the employees decided the risk was too big given these invasive species, but it was a really interesting exercise. When I left the honey farm, I started freelance consulting as a cooperative business development specialist, mostly on Hawaii Island, but to some extent around the state. I worked for the Kohala Center for a few years and on my own. And that was great exposure to the co-op scene in Hawaii. And you know, there are several dozen co-ops. I think that most people don't know about them or don't know that they're co-ops. But the Kauai utility is a great example, right? Kauai's whole electric grid is actually structured as a co-op. And of course, there's more lesser known ones too. But that was all, I guess, a precursor to finally starting my own business with my husband, which was a breadfruit farm in South Kona, and we decided to structure as a worker co-op. So now my husband and I are 2 of 5 worker members. We all own the farm equally. And about a year into starting the farm, we decided to embark on this larger co-op development effort, the Hawaii ʻUlu Producers Cooperative, which is a farmer-owned co-op that started with 9 farms, including our own, so our own plus 8 back in 2016, and it's now grown to over 200 member farms across 4 islands. So I feel like I've definitely done a deep dive into co-ops the last 10 years, including a crash course in starting several of my own. But you know, I love the co-op model. It's just always resonated with me. So I guess it has to do back with those roots on the kibbutz.
And you're the perfect person to be talking about it because you have kind of the academic background, this big international perspective. But now you got 10 years, boots on the ground, living and working. You and I connected around cooperatives, both running cooperatives actually that handled breadfruit. And we've also shared some war stories because while it is a great model, it also opens itself up to all kinds of issues, doesn't it? When you have 250 members that all have, rightfully so, a substantial say in the cooperative. I just want to come back to this cooperative community here in Hawaii. In June last year, the Keomau Center for Sustainable Food Systems, which is part of the University of Hawaiʻi, they convened this meeting for cooperatives, and a lot of them were agriculture cooperatives, and this kind of premise that what if businesses were built not just to profit, but to empower people and communities. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that meeting and just generally this community. What things do you guys share in common? What are some of the struggles that cooperatives in Hawaii face?
Well, if I remember correctly, the meeting had about 60 participants. Half of them represented established co-ops, and the other half were interested in maybe starting a co-op or at least learning more. And I thought that was really interesting, because it means that there is at least as much interest out there in new co-op development as there is in maintaining and growing established co-ops.
Interesting.
Yeah. 2025 also happened to be the UN International Year of Cooperatives,
That's
so
right.
that was fitting.
I want to interrupt you because this year is the International Year of the Women Farmers. So congratulations to all our women farmers out there.
Yes.
United Nations is acknowledging you all year 2026. Sorry to interrupt you. Back to the meeting.
No worries. Yeah. So the co-ops that were there represented really all sectors. There were agricultural cooperatives like us. There were utility co-ops like Kauai. There were housing co-ops in relatively urban or suburban areas. On the farmer co-op side, there was a range. There was, marketing co-ops versus worker-owned farmer co-ops versus supply co-ops versus processing co-ops. So even within a sector or an industry, there was diversity. And I think what we all shared, or what brings us all together as Hawaii's co-ops, is the values around equity and benefiting our local community through a business structure that really honors and preserves integrity of community voice in the business. So with a conventional corporation, the owners may be non-local shareholders. They often are. There isn't necessarily a rootedness to place. And with co-op, it's exactly the opposite. A co-op is owned by the people who use its services, whether those services are electricity or water or a market for crop or access to employment. or a place to live. You know, co-ops can exist really in all sectors, but that's the common thread, that those foundational values about people ensuring that the benefit stays local. And I think that is a strong unifying set of values. I think for the people that were kind of co-op curious, as I like to call them, who wanted to learn more, I think that they, by and large, from what I saw, share those values as well. However, they may not be sure yet if the co-op model is the right way for them to actualize those values. And I think that process of deliberating and assessing what organizational structure is right for you is really important. And a co-op is not necessarily the best organizational model. You know, a co-op can be difficult. It can come with a can of worms. You have to really be prepared to tackle them over the long term. And some of the common challenges include fundraising. You know, a co-op is typically not a nonprofit. So you don't qualify for all the funding opportunities that a public charity would. It also is not a conventional for-profit. You know, venture capitalists are generally not too interested in a co-op because there isn't going to be an exit with a huge profit-making opportunity at the end. I think all the co-ops there also shared the fundraising challenge to some extent. So
cool. Oh, there's a lot to unpack there, but just coming back to this idea of values, and you said something about institutionalizing these things that we want to do well. In the context of Hawaii, how does this cooperative model and cooperativism fit within some of these traditional and cultural values of working together and things like that?
Well, I'm not a native Hawaiian, so that's my disclaimer, but I am married to one, for what that's worth. And you know, what I often hear from my Hawaiian friends and just the Hawaiian community is a phrase like, it's a kākou thing, right? It's less about the I and it's more about the we. That sums up the co-op ethos perfectly. It's not an individual thing. It is, by necessity, a group effort. So I think that really embodies the kākou mindset.
There's some people who say that the cooperative model in Hawaii has been a bit of a failure. And actually, when we look back, we have a long history of co-ops dealing with guava, ginger, eggs, papaya, cattle ranching, water systems. So my question is something like this. Just because a cooperative ceases to exist, does that mean that it was a failure? Or are there some instances in which a transition is not necessarily a failure?
Great question. I think for co-ops to survive over time, they must be continuously adaptive to the changing needs of their members. And so my hunch would be, for those co-ops that have come and gone, they maybe haven't evolved, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. For example, if a co-op was formed to help build the market for a local agricultural crop, and then it's so successful in building the market that all of its members have ample market opportunities on their own, and they don't need the co-op as a market anymore, maybe the co-op served its purpose to help uplift the market to get to a certain point. So I think we should probably look at each case in context before making a judgment call. I would also view really all organizations as living things, because they are in fact a representation of humans, living things, working together. And so just as all living things eventually die, sometimes organizations have to die. You know, sometimes the next generation doesn't want to take it over. Sometimes they do, and that can be a beautiful thing if it's serving the next generation. But maybe one generation, you know, fulfilled its purpose, and the next generation wants to go in a different direction. That's not necessarily a bad thing. That's often natural.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to just kind of take the conversation a little bit wider across the Pacific region. As you know, we do work with farmer organizations, including cooperatives, in 15 Pacific Island countries. And last year, the Deputy Prime Minister in Fiji, who's also the Minister for Cooperatives, said that poor governance is behind the failure of many cooperatives in Fiji, not their structure. He said that most of them have collapsed because of weak leadership, poor record keeping, and failure to follow basic processes. Does that resonate, that experience from Fiji, at least as quoted here, with any of the cooperative stories you've heard here in Hawaii or your experience?
I could certainly see it being valid. In my own experience, I think one of the causes, which is sort of like governance, is corruption. You know, we're all humans at the end of the day, no matter if we choose to form a nonprofit or a for-profit or a co-op, it's always humans behind it. In Israel, one of my advisors had previously been sort of a co-op extension agent for international projects. And in the 60s and 70s in particular, a lot of countries in Asia, Africa, and South America were really interested in adopting the kibbutz model. And so Israel sent different, you know, co-op extension agents, if you will, to these countries to help them with an assessment and to actually move forward if that was determined to be the right decision. And I remember one of the lessons he taught me was that for co-ops to successfully start up and be sustained, you sort of need this coalescing of bottom-up and top-down energy at the same time and in the same place. And that can be hard to find. It can be hard to time just right, you know. Sometimes you have these top-down efforts where the government is saying, we need more co-ops, but the local people isn't really into it, or they don't understand what a co-op is. Other times you have, you know, a local community or sector who says, you know, we really need a co-op to support our farmers, but there's no institutional support. There's no funding available. There's no infrastructure. There's no technical assistance, which is important too. And so I think it is a unique opportunity when the two actually do meet. And sometimes if they meet, but then one goes away and the other sticks around, that can be reason for a decline as well.
Yeah, and just a bit more context to that quote is it was at the beginning of a new program to provide technical support to cooperatives and understanding that some of the weaknesses are in around processes and governance and, you know, making sure that your foundation documents are set up well so that you can deal with some of these issues like corruption or infighting or all of these kinds of things. So I think it does lend itself towards, you know, how do we support the development of cooperatives? Well, we need to really know where some of the failures are. And I just want to bring up this paper that was produced by the Asian Development Bank, and it talks about the key factors contributing towards successful performance of cooperatives to build a harmonious society. And this paper, after doing research across the Pacific, but there was a big focus in Fiji, says the main reasons for failures were that cooperatives were promoted by government and other development agencies instead of the idea originating from the people themselves. It says a top-down approach instead of a bottom-up approach. It says in Fiji, a lot of cooperatives were formed because the government promoted entry of indigenous people into business, and the cooperative idea was thrust upon them. I don't know if you can resonate a little bit. You did allude to this idea of whether or not the idea is kind of imposed from the outside or whether it really is a movement from the farmers or those who are coming together themselves.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that additional context. Now that I understand where the minister was coming from, I do agree with him. I do. I think in the sense that technical support is really important to tackle exactly those things. The structure, the organization, the communication, you know, it's something that evolves over time for co-ops. I don't think you can hit the ground running with everything you'll ever need to figure out. Things definitely need to evolve in response to challenges, but ultimately it is really important to have your stuff together. And Yeah, I have definitely read about multiple different countries where there was a top-down effort that failed, and it didn't matter how much resources they threw out there because the community was not bought in. You know, and a lot of it is education. Like if you think about it, in school we learn, maybe we don't have a business class. I don't know that I ever had a business class, but I did have an economics class. It was required, you know, but we don't learn how to organize ourselves cooperatively. We don't learn how to coordinate among our peers or just among people in our community to accomplish something, to reach some end goal that none of us would be able to on our own. Impossible. We can't. We have to work together to do this. How do we do that? I don't think there's a class on that. Yep. And because of that, there is a lot of technical assistance and education that's needed. And I think that's one of the reasons why some level of institutional support is generally needed. Maybe not, you know, to plant the idea. I think to have the seed of an idea and even to start the planning process and come up with a first business plan, if that can happen from a grassroots level, that's the best. Because then the community really owns it. But sooner or later, I think it's really hard to grow and develop without some institutional support, and that's where the top-down resources can be very useful.
Yeah, interesting. So the Hawaii ʻUlu Co-op is not just a factory that is waiting for people to deliver fruit, but you are heavily engaged in meeting the needs of your farmers. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of the membership service and I guess kind of how in some ways the cooperative is stepping into this public role, which historically has been, you know, delivered through University of Hawaiʻi Extension Service, you know, really kind of problem solving with farmers around agronomic issues and things. So tell us a little bit about your membership service and how it's fulfilling that role.
Sure. Well, our members, being ʻUlu farmers, are mostly just getting started, right? Because there wasn't really a commercial ʻUlu industry much before the co-op. ʻUlu as a whole, while it's an ancient crop, it's new to modern agriculture and all the challenges that come with trying to really produce a crop, not just for home consumption, but for market. And so not long after we started the co-op, it just became clear that our farmers needed support. They had questions about what varieties to plant and how to prune their trees and if to prune their trees and the best harvesting tools, the best post-harvest practices. You know, sometimes the issue would come directly from the farmer where they were identifying their own need, and other times it came from us on the co-op observing challenges that were pretty clear to us on the receiving end of the fruit that multiple farmers were facing. And so we started a partnership with the University of Hawaiʻi to help address some of these challenges through research, extension publications, scientific articles, workshops. UH has not really had a dedicated ʻUlu extension position. I think they did briefly around 2018 to 2020, and then it wasn't just ʻUlu, but it was called like a Sustainable Agriculture Extension Officer on Hawaii Island, and ʻUlu was one of his crops, but then he ended up leaving and they never refilled the position to this day. So in the absence of an extension arm, the co-op has developed a membership department where we employ between 1 and 2 people. Right now we have about 1.5, full-time employees just focused on serving our members by administering technical support, communicating with the farmers so that there is that open line of communication. And with 215 plus farmers, many of them are not necessarily very savvy with technology or internet or email, and so it's a lot of different communication methods: phone, in-person visits, text. It almost has to be tailored to each individual farmer. So it's a lot of work, which is what extension agents usually do. So it's that line of communication, keeping it open, soliciting information, administering the technical support when it's information that we have. And when we don't have that knowledge, it's going back to the university and trying to work with them to get that information, whether it's developing a new resource in partnership with them or basically informing their research efforts, which can sometimes take several years to come back, right, with the knowledge that was requested in the first place. But it's a really important part of building the breadfruit value chain in Hawaii, because the value chain starts with the farmers, and their capacity needs to be high. It needs to be strong. You know, they're producing staple food for our communities. So it's really important to help them reach their production goals, whatever those are. And I'll just add that our farmers are very diverse one from the other. You know, in some ways they're very representative of Hawaii's farming community in that they're very small, they're very diversified. Most of them are not full-time commercial farmers. I think about 2/3 are either part-time commercial or basically backyard subsistence with more than enough production for themselves, and so they're able to sell the excess. But in other ways, they're a little bit different. You know, they tend to be much higher percentage beginning farmers, much higher percentage Native Hawaiian, much younger. I think our average farmer age is about 50 years old compared to 62 years old state average. So you sort of get the picture of maybe the demographics of the ʻUlu co-op farmers or just ʻUlu farmers in Hawaii in general, and then you start drilling down to what their farms look like. Their farms are really diverse. You know, nobody is only growing ʻUlu. Everyone is intercropping in some way, but how they intercrop and what they're intercropping with, those can really vary. Their agroforestry practices and how big their farm is, you know. So there's just so much diversity. I mean, I'm really excited by it. I think it's a beautiful thing, but it does make the technical support services all the more important and all the more challenging.
Thank you so much for this awesome conversation about cooperatives, and we're excited to see where the Hawaii ʻUlu Co-op goes next. Thank you so much, Dana.
Thanks, Kyle.